"Return, my child! Return, my child!" The river queen's cry tore through the still night, echoing like a mother's brief across the dark waters. This is the heartbreaking story of Amarachi, a childless woman who found a baby by the river and discovered too late that some blessings come with a terrible price. What she didn't know was that the child she loved was never meant to be hers. Let me tell you about Amarachi before the sorrow came, before the tears, before the choice that would break her heart into 1,000 pieces. There was a time when Amarachi's name was spoken with admiration in every corner of Umuora village. The elders would nod approvingly when she passed by, saying that one was molded by the gods themselves. Her beauty was the kind that made young girls jealous and their mothers proud. Her skin glowed like honey under the afternoon sun, and her smile could light up a dark room. But it wasn't just her beauty that made people love her. Amarachi had a gentle spirit, the kind that children ran to her with their scraped knees, and old women shared their deepest secrets with her. She moved through the village like a soft breeze, bringing comfort wherever she went. When Chinedu, the chief's eldest son, chose her as his wife, the entire village celebrated for 7 days and 7 nights. The drums never stopped beating. Women danced until their wapas came loose, their voices rising to the heavens in songs of blessing. Amarachi's mother cried tears of joy, knowing her daughter would never know hunger or hardship again. The wedding night was magical. Under a canopy of stars, Chinedu looked into Amarachi's eyes and whispered, "You have made me the proudest man in all the land." She believed him. Oh, how she believed him. For the first few months, their compound was filled with laughter. Chinedu would return from the farms and call out her name even before reaching the door. "Amarachi, my beautiful wife!" And she would run to him, her heart swelling with happiness, preparing his favorite meals and listening to stories of his day. But then the months began to pass. 1 month became 3, 3 became 6, 6 became a year, and Amarachi's belly remained flat. At first, no one said anything. The older women would pat her shoulder gently and say, "Don't worry, my daughter. The gods are simply preparing something special for you." But their eyes told a different story. Their eyes held pity. Chinedu's affection began to cool like evening soup left untouched. He no longer called her name with excitement when he returned home. His smiles became rare, then disappeared completely. The warmth in his eyes turned to something else, something cold, something that made Amarachi's chest tighten with fear every time she looked at him. "Why?" he would ask her in the darkness of their room, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Why has your womb rejected my seed?" Amarachi had no answer. She would lie awake at night, her hands pressed against her empty belly, whispering prayers to every god whose name she knew. "Please," she would beg the darkness, "please give me a child, just one child, that's all I ask." But the gods remained silent. And then came the day that shattered what was left of Amarachi's happiness. The day Chinedu brought home his second wife. Her name was Nkiru, but everyone called her Mama Nkiru even before she had children, as if they already knew what Amarachi feared most would come true. The day Chinedu brought her home, Amarachi was grinding pepper in the backyard. She heard the footsteps first, then the murmuring voices of neighbors gathering at their gate. Her hands froze on the grinding stone. Something in the air had changed, something heavy and finer. When she walked to the front of the compound, wiping her hands on her wrapper, she saw them. Chinedu stood tall and proud, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a young woman Amarachi had never seen before. The woman was not as beautiful as Amarachi, But she was younger, much younger, and the way she looked at Chinedu, with those eager, worshipful eyes, made Amarachi's stomach turn. Chinedu said, "Amarachi," his voice cold and formal as if speaking to a stranger. "This is Nkiru. She will be living here now as my wife." The world tilted. Amarachi grabbed the doorframe to steady herself, her vision blurring at the edges. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fall on her knees and beg him not to do this. But the neighbors were watching, and in our culture, a woman's pain was meant to be swallowed silently, like bitter medicine. So she smiled, a broken, trembling smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Welcome to our home." That night, Amarachi lay on her mat in the outer room, while Chinedu and his new wife laughed together in the room that had once been her own alone. Every sound was a knife to her heart. Every whisper, every soft giggle, every creak of the bed reminded her of what she had lost. She pressed her wrapper against her mouth to muffle her sobs, her whole body shaking with a grief so deep it felt like drowning. The months that followed were the loneliest of Amarachi's life. She watched, silent and invisible, as Nkiru's belly began to swell. First just a small bump, then growing rounder and fuller each day, like a promise being fulfilled, a promise that Amarachi's body had failed to keep. The village women who once admired Amarachi now gathered around Nkiru, their hands touching her growing stomach, their voices filled with excitement and blessings. "This one will be strong," they would say. "Look how she carries, definitely a boy. The chief will be so pleased." Amarachi would stand in the corner, grinding pepper or washing clothes, pretending not to hear, pretending her heart was breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. When Nkiru finally gave birth, the celebration lasted 3 days. It was a boy, healthy and loud, with Chinedu's strong features. The chief himself came to bless the child, placing a hand on the baby's forehead and declaring him the future of their lineage. Chinedu's joy was complete. He walked through the village with his chest puffed out, receiving congratulations from every direction. He bought a goat for the naming ceremony and invited everyone in Umuora to celebrate. Everyone except Amarachi was truly celebrating. She smiled when expected, helped cook the food, served the guests, but inside she was dying slowly, like a plant denied water and sunlight. But what Amarachi didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she walked that lonely path each morning, was that everything was about to change. The river was waiting, and in its depths, a mother's heart was breaking, searching desperately for something precious that had been lost. Soon, very soon, Amarachi would find something by that river that would fill the emptiness in her heart. But that same discovery would bring a darkness to Umuora that no one had ever seen before. The river never forgets, and it never forgives. The morning it happened, Amarachi woke to a silence that felt different, heavier, as if the whole world was holding its breath. It was her cooking day again. She rose before the first cock crow, wrapping her faded cloth around her waist in the darkness. Her joints ached from slipping on the thin mat in the corner of the outer room, far from the comfort of the main bedroom where Nkiru slept with Chinedu and their children. She picked up her clay pot and stepped out into the cold morning air. The path to the river was familiar now. Every root, every stone, every turn memorized by her tired feet. But today, something felt wrong. The usual sounds of the forest were missing. No birds sang, no insects chirped. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. Amarachi paused, her skin prickling with unease. She looked around but saw nothing unusual, just the dark shapes of trees and the narrow path stretching ahead. She shook off the strange feeling and continued walking. When she reached the river, she froze. The water was completely still. Not the gentle stillness of a calm morning, but an unnatural stillness, like glass, like death. The surface didn't ripple, not even a tiny movement. It was as if the river itself had stopped breathing. Amarachi's hands trembled as she knelt at the riverbank. She had been coming to this river all her life, and she had never seen it like this. A cold fear crept up her spine, but she pushed it down. She needed the water. The family would wake soon, and there would be trouble if breakfast wasn't ready. She dipped her pot into the still water, and that's when she heard it. A cry, soft and weak, the unmistakable sound of a baby. Amarachi's heart stopped. She looked around frantically, searching the riverbank, the bushes, the trees. Who would abandon a baby here, in this lonely place? The cry came again, and this time Amarachi realized with shock that it was coming from inside her pot. Her hands shaking violently now, she lifted the heavy pot and looked inside. What she saw made her gasp so sharply that she nearly dropped everything. There, floating in the water she had just drawn, was a baby. But not an ordinary baby. The child was tiny, no bigger than Amarachi's forearm, with skin that shimmered like moonlight on water. But it was the tail that made Amarachi's blood turn to ice. Where the baby's legs should have been, there was a delicate silvery tail that caught the early morning light and sparkled like scattered diamonds. A mermaid. A baby mermaid. Amarachi stumbled backward, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. These were things from old stories, tales the elders told children to scare them away from swimming too deep. They weren't real. They couldn't be real. But the baby cried again, and the sound pierced straight through Amarachi's heart. It was a sound of helplessness, of hunger, of desperate need, the same cry she had imagined hearing from the children she never had. Without thinking, acting purely on instinct, Amarachi reached into the pot. Her fingers touched the baby's impossibly soft skin, and the child immediately quieted, tiny webbed fingers wrapping around Amarachi's thumb. In that moment, looking down at those ancient knowing eyes in that infant face, Amarachi felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Warmth, purpose, love. The baby guggled softly, and Amarachi's eyes filled with tears. "Where did you come from, little one? Where is your mother?" As in answer, a cold wind suddenly swept across the river, making the still water finally ripple. Amarachi heard something in that wind, something that sounded almost like words, almost like a voice calling from very far away. But she pushed the thought aside. The sun was starting to rise, painting the sky pink and gold. She needed to get back before anyone noticed how long she'd been. Amarachi looked down at the baby again. She knew what she should do. She should put the child back in the river. Whatever this creature was, it didn't belong to her. It belonged to the water, to the spirits, to a world she didn't understand. But when she tried to lower the baby back into the pot, her arms wouldn't obey. The child looked up at her with those impossibly deep eyes, and she saw in them something she recognized. Loneliness. The same loneliness that had been eating her alive for years. Just for a little while, she whispered to herself, tucking the baby inside her wrapper, close to her heart. The baby's tail felt cool against her skin, but not unpleasant. The child nuzzled against her chest, making small, contented sounds that filled Amarachi with a fierce, protective love she had never known before. She filled her pot with fresh water, hoisted it on her head, and hurried back to the compound. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone would hear it. But when she arrived, the compound was still quiet. Nikiru's children were just beginning to wake, their sleepy voices calling for their mother. No one saw Amarachi slip into her small corner room. No one saw her create a hiding place for the baby in an old basket covered with cloth. No one knew that the childless, forgotten first wife now had a secret that would change everything. As Amarachi began preparing breakfast, her hands moving automatically through familiar tasks, she kept glancing toward her room. The baby was quiet now, sleeping peacefully. Every few minutes, she would find an excuse to check on her, just to be sure she was still there, that she hadn't been a dream. For the first time in 7 years, Amarachi smiled a real smile, a smile that reached her eyes and warmed her entire face. She didn't know that at that very moment, deep in the river, something ancient and powerful was awakening. She didn't know that a mother's heart was beginning to rage with a fury that would shake the very foundations of Umuara. She didn't know that the river had already marked her, and the river always collects its debts.